if you're looking for some safe pickups that won't be hit by BANLIST and will be competitive in most if not all new formats, then you're in the right place. What's up guys, my name is Tcg Sam, and today's video I'm going to be going over 5 BANLIST proof decks that I think you should consider picking up regardless of what your preferred playstyle is and regardless of what your budget is. There's sure to be something here for everyone. Without any further ado, let's hop straight into the video. For each of these decks, I'm going to first be going over the price point, $1 sign being fairly budget friendly, under $50 US or so, $2 signs being 50 to 100 US, and $3 signs being over 100 US. Now keep in mind, these are just rough price estimates for the core engine of the deck, so it's not counting staples or anything, but also these prices are subject to change depending on a ban list or a reprint, so just keep that in mind. For each of these decks, I'm going to be going over their playstyle and some of their strengths and why I think that they're very good in a open format where people don't really know what to play, or in general why I think that they'll be good regardless of any ban list that comes. So the first deck, like I mentioned, is Spright, and this is a mid-range and combo deck that generally tries to end on a fairly big board. I think Spright's biggest strength is going to come from how flexible it can be as a pure deck or as an engine. You can play it as a pure deck, which aims to put out like a pretty mid-rangey board with, let's say, double toad plus like some follow-up and like red and carrot negates, which are pretty solid into most decks out there. Or you could choose to play it as an engine complemented with other decks as well, to change up the playstyle a little bit to either be more control-ish or even more combo heavy than it currently is. Now, speaking of those different variants, I would say the 3 most common variants of Spright are going to be Runic, Evil Twin, and Fur Hire. Now, in the past, we have seen people combine like Fur Hire and Runic and Live Twin as well. So you can sort of mix and match these engines as well, which just goes to show how flexible the Spright engine can be by itself. Regardless, these 3 engines I think are going to be the most relevant for Spright. These will allow you to adjust the end board, and depending on the format, one might be better than the other. So for example, if a format is a little bit slower and you can afford to play more of a control game, you could consider putting in the Runics and the Fur Hire, since these give you a great grind game and have very strong resource games that not a lot of decks can match out there. Or if you want a more combo heavy build that just wants to aim to spit out as big of a board turn 1 as possible, you could consider just playing the Evil Twin package in there as well, since the Evil Twins do give you some access to some very powerful end board pieces and follow. Overall, Spright is a very flexible engine that should be good regardless of whatever ban list is out there, just because of how many variants there are and how flexible it can be overall as a deck. Next up, for the control players, Labrynth I think is a pretty solid pickup as well. It's like middle of the pack in terms of how budget friendly it is. There's a few higher rarity cards that are still somewhat expensive, but aside from that, most of the core has been reprinted, so it shouldn't be too bad. It is generally played as a control deck, although you can make it a little more mid-rangey with some of the different variants of Labrynth out there. But I think that one of the biggest strengths of Labrynth is going to be how resilient it is to common blowouts. Now, if you think about how strong cards like Dimension Shifter, Nibiru, Droll, and Lockbird can be against the top decks out there, you'll notice that they don't really hit Labrynth at all. And I think that Labrynth has that strength going for it because it's never really caught in the crossfire of targeted hate towards like the best decks of the format. Like the 3 hand traps I mentioned before, they're generally going to be played in a very combo heavy format where the best decks just aim to spit out a bunch of monsters onto the board, and because those are the only hand traps that are really able to stop them, whereas they don't do anything to Labrynth at all, so no one's really going to be siding for it unless it's somehow one of the most represented decks in the room. One of its other strengths as well, like I mentioned earlier, is its flexible playstyle. You can play it more of a control style with Floodgates and trying to protect it with cards like Lord of the Heavenly Prison, and sort of just summoning out big monsters with your Welcome Labrynth traps and just beating down your opponent from there. Or you could choose to play more of a mid-range build with powerful normal trap cards like Daruma Cannon and a Unchained engine to make it so your turn 1 end boards have a little more oomph to them that don't solely rely on Floodgates. So I think that its flexibility plus how resilient it is to common blowouts make Labrynth a pretty solid choice if you're more of a control player. Next up are going to be Cyberse decks, so specifically Salamangreat and Marincess. These are generally very cheap, I guess, aside from the 1 card in Salamangreat, Raging Phoenix, since it is currently being played in fire decks, but I think in the future, if it either gets reprinted or fire decks somehow get hit, it should drop down in price, making both these strategies very affordable. I would say both these decks are sort of the definition of mid-range. If you're looking for a deck that does like one or two things very well and can do that very consistently, I'd say that these decks are for you. They're able to put out a decent board with maybe a few points of interaction, but they always have strong follow-up and have a very adaptable main deck to where they can play a bunch of hand traps. So regardless of whether the format is one where a bunch of hand traps are needed or maybe hand traps aren't as good, the main deck is flexible enough to where you can move around cards like by either playing more extenders, more hand traps, things like that. It's sort of self-contained as well, since you do have a lot of resource generation and management with both of these decks. One of its strengths as well is access to a flexible link toolbox. So since Cyberse links are generally some of the most powerful links out there, like if you think cards like Update Jammer, Access Go Talker, Trans Go Talker, these are very powerful cards that are very easy for Cyberse decks to summon. There are cards in both of these decks that do lock you into water or fire, but outside of that, just having the possibility of playing those powerful Cyberse generic extra deck cards, I think give this deck a unique strength as well, since those link monsters are just so powerful yet locked behind being played in a Cyberse only deck. Next up, if you're more of a combo player and do have a bigger budget, Memento I think is something you should consider as well. Memento's engine is fairly expensive because of Anguish, and you can argue that playing the Fiendsmith engine is necessary to make it good, so I have put the $$ because it can be a pretty expensive deck. But outside of that, I think that it's a pretty strong combo deck that's definitely not going to get hit on the ban list unless they somehow hit the Fiendsmith engine. But even if they hit the Fiendsmith engine, the Memento cards by themselves are very powerful and can do a lot of great plays. It can play more of a mid-rangey combo deck with a lot of resource management, or can play as a big combo deck that's able to set up a large end board that's very difficult for your opponent to break. One of its strengths as well is its resilience to common non-engine cards. So generally against this deck, not only is it fairly hard to hand trap because people are unfamiliar with it, it also has ways to play around common cards like Droll and Lockbird and Nibiru, which I think is very strong in a deck since those cards are very popular in most metagames. So just being able to have an in-engine way to play around it, I think makes Memento a pretty strong choice. It's also very flexible in terms of what its end board can be, since none of the cards really lock you, so you can easily adjust your end board to whatever suits the format best. Next up is Mimighoul, and this one is maybe a little bit more speculative, but I would say that Mimighoul is a pretty low risk pickup because the cards are so cheap at the moment, and since it is a TCG exclusive, it is likely to get more support in the future. Although whether the support is good or not remains to be seen. Even if the new support isn't good, I think the first wave of cards is good enough to where you're still able to play it as a semi-coherent strategy, either as a control deck or as more of a mid-range deck. You could play it more of a control deck and sort of focus on the lock that Mimighoul Dungeon gives you, where your opponent can't normal summon if they have a set monster, and you could just play it with a bunch of traps and sort of treat it like an alternate version of Labrynth. Or you could choose to play more of a mid-range build with cards like Kashtira or Fiendsmith. Since this deck doesn't really lock you into anything, you're able to use the bodies it generates very well for generic link plays like going into the Fiendsmith engine, or even using something like Kashtira Unicorn on the very first turn to rip cards out of your opponent's extra deck. Regardless of whatever is good in the format, if it's a slower format where a control version will be better, or if it's more of a combo heavy format where you need to have a more combo focused deck, I think that overall the Mimighoul engine is pretty strong and definitely has a lot of potential to get good support in the future. So like I mentioned, once again, purely speculative because it is possible that we get new support that isn't very good, but even if we get support that's completely useless, I still feel like the cards have so much potential on their own, as you've probably seen a lot on YouTube recently. And then finally, I just want to go over 3 honorable mentions that didn't end up making the final list, but I still wanted to talk about because I feel each of these decks has their own merits. Now, the first one is going to be Ritual Beast. It is a little bit more on the expensive end, but I think Ritual Beast is a very strong combo deck that, if you're able to master it, can make it so you're able to simply just outplay a lot of your opponents, since they won't really know how to properly interact with the cards. It's also able to put up pretty oppressive end boards with cards like Protos, as well as Ritual Beast Steeds, and a bunch of follow-up as well. The reason I didn't put it on my top 5 is because it does sort of lean heavily into Dimension Shifter, and if Dimension Shifter does get hit, then it's possible this deck won't be as good. Similarly with pure Kashtira, I think that if Dimension Shifter were to get hit, the deck does become a lot worse, but I did still want to talk about it because it is sort of more of a budget-friendly option out there, since the cards are pretty cheap aside from Fenrir, I believe. So being able to play Kashtira as sort of like a mid-rangey control style where you're able to just have solid trades with your Kashtira monsters 1-for-1 and then just overwhelm your opponent with big monsters, I think is a simple playstyle, yet can be good in certain formats. And then finally, Chimera, it's a pretty combo heavy deck, and it is more on the expensive side. I think that it has so much potential just because of how powerful some of the illusion monsters are out there, and how some of the powerful end boards it can put up with cards like Diabells. It can do crazy things like send Dark Barrier Statue to the graveyard and bring it back. And I think that it's just overall a pretty solid deck, but it just didn't make the final cut because it can be a little bit fragile. There are some hands where you just lose to a single hand trap. I think it's pretty important for a deck to be consistently resilient against hand traps just because of how common they are in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But yeah, those are the honorable mentions. I think these decks are very solid and you definitely can consider picking them up. I just thought they all had some potential flaw that prevented me from putting them in the top 5. I just want to give a quick shout out to Your Playmat and CardTrader Zero. If you want to get your own custom playmats, tabletop mats, or card sleeves, be sure to check out Your Playmat using my affiliate link in the description below. You'll get 10% off your order, plus you'll be helping to support the channel. Similarly with CardTrader Zero, I also have an affiliate link in the description below, which if you use, you'll be getting some benefit as well as support the channel. So with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And let me know in the comment section below if you think there are any decks or strategies that I missed in this video that deserve to be talked about. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.